If Parliament abolished the common where you grazed your 2 cows, you did not simply lose the grazing, you were sent an invoice. A share of the surveyor's fee, a share of the commissioner's fee, the solicitor's bill, and the cost of building the fences that shut you out, payable by you in cash, usually within the year. If you could not find the money, and most could not, you sold the small allotment you had just been awarded to the neighbour who could. Nobody broke a law doing any of this. It was done by Act of Parliament, and the documents are still sitting in the county archives. Between 1604 and 1914, the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed more than 5,200 private acts, each one dealing with the fields and commons of a single parish. Together, they transferred about 6.8 million acres, something close to a fifth of the land surface of England, out of shared use and into private, fenced, individual ownership. Nobody was robbed. That is the thing about it that is hard to hold in your head. Every acre was moved by statute, by a commission, by a surveyor with a chain, and by a document signed and sealed and deposited with the clerk of the peace, where a great many of them still sit. And the people who lost the most were, in a very large number of cases, sent the bill for the process that dispossessed them. This is the story of how England was fenced in by paperwork, and of the single procedural detail that decided who paid. Start with what a common actually was, because almost everything written about enclosure in popular history gets this wrong, and getting it wrong makes the whole thing incomprehensible. A common was not empty land. It was not unowned land. It was not land that anybody could wander onto and use as they pleased. The soil of a common almost always belonged to somebody, usually the lord of the manor. What made it a common was that other people held rights over it. Specific, defined, legally recognized rights, and they had names that survive in the law reports to this day. The right of common of pasture, to graze a stated number of animals. The right of pannage, to turn pigs into the woods, to eat acorns and beech mast in autumn. The right of estovers, to take wood for fuel, for repairing a house, for making tools and hedges. The right of turbary, to cut peat or turf for burning. The right of piscary, to take fish. And beyond the named rights, the customs, gleaning after harvest, taking bracken for bedding, gathering furze, running geese on the green. Here is the crucial point. These rights did not belong to people, they belonged to holdings. The right to graze 4 cows on the common was attached to a particular cottage or a particular strip of arable land, and it passed with that property, and it was as much a piece of property as the cottage itself. So a common was a piece of land with 2 sets of owners, one who owned the soil and a defined group who owned specified uses of it. Which is a perfectly workable arrangement, and it worked in some parishes for 600 years. The arable land was organized on the same principle, and it looked stranger still. Instead of a farm being a block of land with a house in the middle, a holding was a scatter of narrow strips distributed across 2 or 3 enormous open fields. A man with 30 acres might hold them in 40 separate strips, spread through every furlong in the parish, on the good soil and the bad, the wet ground and the dry, the sheltered slope and the exposed one. That sounds like an accident or the residue of some ancient muddle. It was not. It was a deliberate structure, and once you see what it was for, the whole system stops looking primitive and starts looking like an insurance policy. If your holding is 1 block on one soil and that soil floods or that slope is caught by a late frost, you have lost everything. If your holding is 40 strips scattered across every kind of ground in the parish, no single local disaster takes more than a fraction of it. In an economy with no crop insurance, no futures markets, no reliable credit for a smallholder, and no way to buy food if your own harvest failed, distribution across risk was the difference between a hard year and a dead family. The whole thing was regulated, and this matters enormously for what comes later. The manor court set the rules and enforced them: what was sown where, when the harvest ended, when the stock could be turned onto the stubble, and how many animals each holding could put on the common. That last one has a name: stinting. The number of beasts you could graze was fixed in proportion to your holding and enforced by an officer of the manor. Which means the standard argument about commons, the one everybody has heard, does not describe this system at all. The argument is that shared resources are inevitably wrecked because each user takes as much as he can while the cost of the damage is spread across everybody. It is a genuinely important idea. It is also, as a description of an English open-field parish, simply false. It is false because these were not open-access resources. They were regulated common property, with defined members, defined quotas, defined seasons, an enforcement officer, a court, and fines. That is not the absence of management. It is a particular form of it. The economist Elinor Ostrom spent a career documenting exactly this point across the world and won a Nobel Prize for it in 2009. Long-lasting commons are not free-for-alls. They have boundaries, rules made by the people bound by them, monitoring, and graduated penalties. The English manor had every one of those features. So hold that in place, because it changes what enclosure actually was. Enclosure was not the imposition of order on chaos. It was the replacement of one property system, collective and regulated, with another, individual and absolute. Now, why would anyone want to replace it? There were real arguments, and it is worth taking them seriously because a story where one side has no case is a story that has been simplified. The first argument was time. A man with 40 scattered strips spends a significant part of his working life walking between them and moving his implements and his animals along the balks between other men's crops. The second was innovation. In an open field on a common rotation, you cannot unilaterally change what you grow or when you grow it. If the parish sows barley in that field this year, you sow barley. If the stock is turned onto the stubble on a fixed date, your experiment ends on that date. The improvements of the 18th century, turnips and clover in the rotation, selective breeding of livestock, under drainage, were easier on land where one person made the decisions. Some of them were close to impossible without it. The third was disease and breeding. A common herd means every animal in the parish shares air and water with every other, and it means you cannot control what your cows breed with. A man trying to improve a bloodline cannot do it in a mixed herd on a common. Those are honest arguments, and they were made by serious people. The counter-argument was equally honest, and it was about a different thing entirely, not efficiency, but the structure of a household's income. For a family at the bottom of rural society, the common was the margin that made the difference between independence and dependence. A cow on the common gave milk, geese gave meat and feathers, furs and turf gave fuel that did not have to be bought. Add gleaning after the harvest, and a few weeks of work, and a garden, and you have a household that is poor but standing on its own feet. Take the common away, and every one of those inputs has to be purchased with wages. The same acre can therefore produce more grain after enclosure and leave a specific family measurably worse off, and both of those statements can be true at once. That tension is the whole political history of the subject, and it was visible to contemporaries from the very beginning. The first great wave of enclosure had nothing to do with Parliament, and it was violent enough to produce a national panic. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, wool prices made sheep more profitable than tenants, and landlords in the Midlands began pulling down houses and laying arable to pasture. The result was depopulating enclosure, whole hamlets emptied, the plough replaced by a shepherd and a dog, and a population of former tenants on the roads. It generated one of the most famous sentences in English prose. In 1516, Thomas More published Utopia, and in it he wrote of England that the sheep, once so meek and tame and small eaters, had become so great devourers and so wild that they ate up and swallowed down the very men themselves. It was not merely a literary complaint. In 1517, Cardinal Wolsey launched a national inquiry into enclosures, with commissioners sent into the counties to record where houses had been thrown down and how much arable had been converted. The state was frightened of it. Statutes followed, repeatedly across the 16th century, requiring houses to be rebuilt and land returned to tillage. They were enforced patchily and evaded steadily, which is what happens to a law that runs against a price signal. And in 1607, it produced a rising. The Midland Revolt in Northamptonshire, Warwickshire and Leicestershire saw thousands of people tearing down hedges and filling ditches under leaders who called themselves levellers, the first use of that word in English politics 4 decades before it acquired its later meaning. The revolt was crushed. The revolt was crushed. But the episode establishes something important for the rest of the story. Enclosure by force was contentious, resisted, and repeatedly checked by a state that regarded the depopulation of villages as a public danger. So how did the same process become respectable, orderly, and unstoppable? By changing who did it. That is the pivot of this entire story, and it turns on a problem that sounds technical and is not. The problem is unanimity. Suppose you are the largest landowner in a parish and you want the open fields consolidated. Under the old law, you could do it by agreement, and agreement meant agreement. Every person with a legal interest had to consent, because you were extinguishing their property rights. In a parish with 40 proprietors, 4 of whom think the scheme is against their interests, that is the end of it. 4 people can veto a change that 36 want. And the 4 who hold out are, very often, precisely the people with the least land and the most to lose. There is a mechanism in the English Constitution that solves that problem completely, and it had been sitting there since the Middle Ages. Parliament can pass a private act, a statute, dealing with a particular person, place, or estate, rather than with the country at large. A private act binds everybody. It does not ask the minority. It overrides their consent, extinguishes their rights, substitutes a compensation process, and does the whole thing with the full authority of the Crown in Parliament. That is the machine. Everything else in the history of English enclosure between 1750 and 1850 is the story of that machine being used, refined, made cheaper, and applied to parish after parish until roughly 1/5 of the country had been through it. The numbers tell you when it happened. There is a trickle of enclosure, acts in the 17th century and the early 18th. Then two great surges, and both of them line up with something specific: war and the price of wheat. The first surge runs through the 1760s and 1770s. The second, much larger, runs from the mid-1790s to about 1815. The years of the wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, when the corn trade with the continent was disrupted and wheat prices reached heights nobody had seen. High grain prices make it worth spending money to bring rough ground into cultivation and to squeeze more out of the fields you have. Enclosure was expensive, and it was undertaken when the return justified the outlay. The curve of acts through time is, to a first approximation, the curve of the wheat price. And that is the first thing to hold on to about the whole process. It was not a plot. It was an investment decision taken by people responding to prices using a legal instrument that happened to place the entire cost of their decision on people who had not made it. Now the procedure itself, step by step, because the procedure is where the outcome was decided. It began with a promoter, or a group of them, typically the lord of the manor, the tithe owner, and the largest freeholders. They would meet, agree the principle, and instruct a parliamentary agent, a solicitor who specialized in getting bills through Westminster. Notice then had to be given, and the form of it tells you a great deal about the world this happened in. Under the standing orders of both houses, notice of the intended bill had to be affixed to the door of the parish church and read out on 3 successive Sundays. The church door, because that is where the parish gathered and where public notice reached everybody. It is a genuinely open procedure, provided you can read, are in church, and understand what a bill of enclosure will mean for your 2 cows. Then the consent requirement, and here is the detail that decides the entire history. Parliament did not require a majority of the proprietors to consent. It required, by convention, the consent of the owners of roughly 3/4 to 4/5 of the land, measured by value. 1 do, by value, not by head. So in a parish of 40 proprietors, where one man holds half the land, the vicar holds 1/5 by way of glebe and tithe, and 2 large farmers hold another 1/5 between them. 4 people can carry the bill against the wishes of the other 36. That single word, value, is the mechanism. It converted a rule that looked like a strong protection for the minority into a rule that guaranteed control by the largest owners, and it did so without anybody having to argue that the poor should be disregarded. If a petition against the bill was raised, it would be heard by a committee of the House. Some were successful. Most were not, and the reasons are structural. Opposing a bill at Westminster required a solicitor, travel to London, and money, all of which the promoters had and the objectors generally did not. Once the act passed, it named the commissioners, usually 3, sometimes more, and this is the point at which an ordinary parish was placed for 2 or 3 years under an authority with almost no appeal. The commissioners were typically land surveyors and agents of some standing from outside the parish, and they were named in the act, which meant that in practice they were nominated by the promoters who drafted it. Their powers were extraordinary. They received and adjudicated every claim to every right over every acre. They decided which claims were valid. They laid out the new roads and drains. They determined where each person's allotment would be, and they made the final award, and their decision was effectively final. They were paid out of the enclosure itself, and so were the surveyors, the solicitors, the clerks, and the cost of obtaining the act at Westminster. all of it came out of the parish, charged to the allottees in proportion to what they received. Then came the claims, and this is where the first great division opened between people who looked, to a casual eye, quite similar. To receive an allotment, you had to prove a right. A freeholder with a deed proved it easily. A copyholder whose title was recorded on the manor roll proved it. A tenant with a lease proved his interest in it. But a great many people used the commons under custom rather than under documented title. The cottager whose family had grazed a cow on the waste for 3 generations without anybody minding. The squatter on the edge of the moor whose grandfather built a cottage there. When those people came before the commissioners, they were asked what right they claimed and on what basis. Where the claim rested on custom alone, with nothing in writing and no manorial record, the commissioners frequently found they had no legal right at all, and they received nothing. They had, in the plainest sense, been using something they did not own. The court could hardly find otherwise, and the effect was that enclosure did not merely redistribute property. It converted a set of informal, customary, working arrangements into a binary question of documented title and then answered it. For those who did receive allotments, the second division opened immediately, and it was financial rather than legal. Your allotment came with a legal obligation attached to fence it. Within a stated period, usually a matter of months, you had to enclose your new parcel with a hedge, a ditch, a wall, or a fence to a standard specified in the award. That obligation is entirely reasonable. Consolidated fields only work if the boundaries hold, and one unfenced parcel ruins the arrangement for everybody. And it was, for a small allottee, ruinous. Consider the arithmetic. A man is awarded 4 acres in place of his strips and his common rights. He must pay his share of the cost of the act, the commissioners, the surveyor, and the lawyers. He must then hedge and ditch the perimeter of 4 acres. The bills arrive as cash demands in a short window to a household whose income has always been mostly in kind and in labor, and whose access to the free inputs that used to cover the gap, the fuel, the grazing, the geese, has just been extinguished. There were 2 ways to meet it. You could borrow if anybody would lend to you, or you could sell the allotment, which was now a clean, marketable, unencumbered parcel of land, to somebody with money, very often to one of the promoters. That is the mechanism, not confiscation. A bill, correctly issued at the worst possible moment to the person least able to pay it. The land moved to whoever could meet the costs of the transfer, which is a description of what happens whenever the costs of a legal change are placed on the party who did not want it. And when the process was finished, it produced an object, and the object is why we can be so precise about all of this 2 centuries later. The enclosure award is a physical document, usually written on parchment or heavy paper, frequently several feet across, and accompanied by a map drawn to scale by the surveyor. It was executed by the commissioners and deposited with the clerk of the peace for the county. On the map, every new allotment is drawn, numbered, and colored. In the text, every allotment is described by acreage and by boundary assigned to a named person and burdened with the specific fencing obligations that person now owed. The new roads are laid out on it, with their widths stated, which is why the roads across former open field in the English Midlands are so often dead straight, unnaturally wide, and lined with wide grass verges. Those verges are a legal specification from an award of the 1790s, still visible from a car. The hedges are on it too. A very large proportion of the hedgerows that people now regard as the timeless English countryside were planted in a single burst to a legal deadline at the expense of the person who received the land between about 1760 and 1830. The awards survive in county record offices in their thousands. It is the best documented mass transfer of property in European history, and the documentation exists precisely because the process was orderly, statutory, and public. That documentation also allows the honest question to be asked, which is, did it work? Ooh. Did enclosure actually increase output enough to justify what it cost? And who received the increase? The traditional answer, taught for a century, was straightforward. Enclosure was the agricultural revolution. It made the improvements possible. The improvements fed the growing towns, and the towns made the industrial revolution. A hard process, but a necessary one. The modern research is considerably less comfortable, and the most important body of it belongs to the economic historian Robert Allen, who went back to the parish-level records and separated the questions. His finding, put simply, is that the great gains in English agricultural productivity came earlier than the parliamentary enclosures and largely from the open-field farmers themselves, the yeoman's revolution, achieved by people adopting new rotations and better stock inside the old system. The parliamentary enclosures of 1760 to 1830, on his numbers, raised output on the enclosed land by a modest margin. They raised rents by a great deal more. The gain, in other words, was substantially a transfer from tenants to landlords rather than a creation of new wealth. That conclusion is contested, as everything in this field is contested. And the honest position is that the productivity gain was real, but smaller than the traditional story claims, and the distributional effect was larger. Which brings the argument to the question that has generated more heat than any other. Did enclosure drive people off the land and into the factories? The case that it did was made most powerfully by J.L.L. and Barbara Hammond, whose book, The Village Labourer, published in 1911, presented enclosure as the deliberate expropriation of the English peasantry and the manufacture of a landless working class. The case against was made by later historians, notably J.D. Chambers and Gordon Mingay, and it rests on hard evidence. Enclosure itself created a great deal of work: hedging, ditching, road making, draining, and the parishes that were enclosed did not empty. Rural population in most enclosed parishes went up, not down. Both are right about different things, and the reconciliation is worth stating carefully. Enclosure did not physically expel people from villages. What it did was change what a poor household was. Before, a labourer with common rights was a labourer with an independent margin, a cow, fuel, a few geese, a garden, and gleaning. After, the same man was a labourer with wages and nothing else. He still lived in the parish, he was still employed. He had become entirely dependent on a wage and on the poor rate when the wage failed. And the poor rate did rise sharply in the enclosing counties in exactly this period, which is a measurable fact and the closest thing to a scoreboard we have. In 1795, the magistrates of Berkshire adopted the Speenham land system, subsidizing wages from the rates on a scale tied to the price of bread. That is what a society does when a large group has lost the ability to bridge a bad year on its own resources. The Commons had been that bridge. When it went, the parish became the bridge, and the parish paid for it out of rates levied on the same property owners who had promoted the enclosures. People did fight it, and the largest sustained resistance is worth following, because it shows both what objectors could do and the exact point at which they ran out of options. Otmoor is a low, wet basin of about 4,000 acres in Oxfordshire, shared between 7 parishes, and for centuries it had been used as rough common grazing. Poor land, but a great deal of it, and free. An act to enclose it was obtained in 1815, after years of argument, and the scheme involved straightening the River Ray to drain the moor. The commoners' objection was partly that they were losing their grazing, and partly a specific technical complaint that the drainage works were making the flooding worse on the land they had left. In 1830, they acted on it. Groups went out at night and broke the new banks and fences. Then, in September, several hundred people walked the entire boundary of the moor in daylight in a deliberate reenactment of the old parish perambulation, destroying enclosure fences as they went. That was a legally shrewd choice, as well as a defiant one. A perambulation was a recognized customary act, and doing it in the open as a community framed the destruction as the assertion of a right rather than a nighttime crime. The yeomanry were called out, and about 40 of the participants were arrested and taken under escort to Oxford. The escort chose the wrong day. They arrived during St. Giles's Fair, into a city packed with a holiday crowd, and the crowd rescued the prisoners in the street. The disturbances went on in one form or another for another 5 years, with troops stationed in the district and fences going down again as fast as they went up. The cry recorded at the time was simply "Otmoor For Ever." And in the end, the enclosure stood. That is the necessary part of the story. The resistance was determined, popular, sustained for half a decade, and legally imaginative, and it changed nothing about the award, because the award had already been made by a body against which there was no appeal under an act that Parliament was not going to revisit. What Otmoor demonstrates is that the decisive moment in an enclosure was never the fence. It was the committee stage of a private bill in Westminster 2 or 3 years earlier, attended by a solicitor paid by the promoters and by nobody from Otmoor at all. There is a person who recorded the experience of this from the inside, and his testimony is the reason the subject has any emotional temperature at all in England. John Clare was born in 1793 at Helpston in Northamptonshire, the son of a farm labourer, and became a labourer himself before he became one of the most precisely observant poets in the language. His parish was enclosed by an act obtained in 1889 when he was 16. He watched the whole procedure happen to a landscape he knew, plant by plant and path by path. The commons fenced, the old crooked lanes straightened and gated. Streams diverted into cuts, trees felled, notices going up on what had been open ground. In the poem usually printed as "The Moors," he set down what it looked like from where he stood, and the lines are as close to primary evidence as poetry gets. That enclosure came and trampled on the grave of labour's rights and left the poor a slave. Clare is not a neutral witness, and he should not be read as one. He is, however, a witness of a particular kind that this story otherwise lacks entirely. A man of exactly the class that lost, who could write and who wrote it down at the time. There is a second witness of an entirely different kind, and he is more damaging to the enclosers because he was one of them. Arthur Young was the most influential agricultural writer in Britain, the secretary to the Board of Agriculture, and for most of his career an unrestrained enthusiast for enclosure. He travelled the country cataloguing improvement and dismissing the open fields as a relic. And then, in the early 1800s, having looked at what had actually happened to the poor in the parishes he had championed, he wrote one of the sharpest recantations in English public life, that he would rather all the commons in England were sunk in the sea than that the poor should continue to be treated on enclosing as they had been treated hitherto. He did not stop believing in improvement. He had simply worked out that the improvement and the treatment of the poor were separable, and that the second had been handled disgracefully because nobody with power had any reason to handle it otherwise. One thing before we go on, if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of British financial history every single day. And leave a comment while you are here. It matters more than you would think. Parliament, to be fair to it, noticed. And the way it responded is a study in how a legislature fixes the cheap part of a problem and leaves the expensive part alone. In 1801, the General Enclosure Act consolidated the clauses that every Private Enclosure Act had been repeating, so that a new bill could incorporate them by reference rather than restating them. It was a genuine reform, and it cut the cost of obtaining an act substantially. Note what it did, though. It made enclosure cheaper and faster. It did not alter the consent threshold, the commissioner's powers, or the allocation of costs. The efficiency of the machine was improved. The distribution of its outputs was not touched. In 1836 came a further step. Parishes could enclose without a private act at all, where 2/3 of the proprietors in number and value agreed. In 1845, the General Enclosure Act created a permanent body of enclosure commissioners in London, who could authorize enclosures under a general procedure. And the 1845 Act did, at last, address the poor. It required that provision be considered for allotments for the labouring poor and for public recreation grounds in schemes brought before the commissioners. The result is worth stating precisely because it is the measure of how late and how small the correction was. Under the schemes that followed, the acreage set aside for field gardens and recreation grounds ran to a few thousand acres against hundreds of thousands enclosed under the same act. It was a gesture made after the great wave had passed. By then, however, something else had changed, and it changed the ending of this story completely. The country had acquired a large urban middle class, and that class had discovered that it wanted somewhere to walk on a Sunday. The commons that survived longest were the ones nearest the towns, the rough ground on the edge of London and Manchester and Birmingham that nobody had thought worth the cost of enclosing. As the towns expanded, those commons became first valuable and then contested. The turning point came at Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire in 1866, and it is one of the most enjoyable episodes in English legal history because it involved a peer of the realm, a barrier of iron railings, and a train full of navvies. Lord Brownlow, Lord of the Manor, had enclosed a large part of Berkhamsted Common with about 3 miles of iron fencing, extinguishing the commoners' grazing. The commoners had rights, but no money to litigate, which was the usual and decisive fact. Augustus Smith was a wealthy man, Member of Parliament, and the lessee of the Isles of Scilly, and he owned land in the parish that carried common rights. He decided that the fence would come down, and that it would come down in a manner that forced the question into court on his terms. On the night of the 5th of March 1866, he sent a special train from Euston carrying about 120 labourers with tools. They arrived in the small hours, worked through the night, and by morning the entire 3 miles of iron fencing had been dismantled and stacked, and the common was open. Nobody was hurt, nothing was burned, and the fencing was carefully preserved rather than destroyed, which mattered because it made the act a trespass to be argued about rather than a riot to be prosecuted. Brownlow sued. Smith, who could afford the litigation, defended, and the case was decided in favour of the commoners. The following year, the Commons Preservation Society, founded in 1865 by George Shaw Lefevre, took up the model and ran it as a strategy. Find a common under threat, find a commoner with a defensible right, fund the litigation from subscriptions, and establish the point. It worked repeatedly. The Society's litigation over Epping Forest ran for years and ended with the Epping Forest Act of 1878, which extinguished the enclosures, vested the forest in the Corporation of London, and required it to be kept unenclosed for the recreation of the public forever. Wimbledon Common, Hampstead Heath, Ashdown Forest, Banstead Downs. The same pattern of cases produced the map of open space around London that is now taken for granted. It was not preserved by sentiment. It was preserved by people who had understood that the fight was about legal standing and money. And in 1876 Parliament, having spent a century assisting enclosure, reversed its default. The Commons Act of that year required that any proposed enclosure be shown to be for the public benefit, not merely the benefit of the parties, and the number of new enclosures collapsed almost to nothing. The last enclosure. Acts were passed shortly before the First World War. The machine that had moved a fifth of England simply stopped. Not because it was repealed, but because the case for using it could no longer be made. So what was left? The registration exercise carried out under the Commons Registration Act of 1965 produced the first full inventory, and the answer is that England retains something in the region of 3% of its land area as registered common land, most of it upland grazing in the north and west, and much of the rest in scattered greens and small commons. 3%, from a starting point where open field and common were the ordinary condition of the English parish. That is the scale of what happened, and it happened entirely through documents. It is worth being careful here about a comparison that gets made constantly and is genuinely misleading. What happened in the Scottish Highlands in the same period was not the same process. The clearances did not require Acts of Parliament because Scots law had already resolved the ownership question in the landlord's favour. Tenants held at will without the layered customary rights that English commoners could take before a commissioner. Where an English cottager could at least make a claim and be refused, a Highland tenant frequently had no claim to make. The results looked similar from a distance. A countryside emptied of people, land turned to sheep, and the mechanisms were completely different. Conflating them makes both harder to understand, and it obscures the specific English point, which is about procedure. The other comparison is more useful. Across the Channel, the revolutionary settlement after 1789 broke up the great estates and produced a countryside of peasant proprietors, and France still has a farm structure that reflects it. England went the other way, and the parliamentary enclosures are the largest single reason why. The country that industrialized first was also the country that entered the modern era with an unusually small number of people owning an unusually large proportion of the land. That is not a historical curiosity. Modern estimates, most prominently the work published by the researcher Guy Shrubsole in 2009, suggest that around half of England is owned by well under 1% of its population, with the aristocracy and landed gentry still holding a very substantial share. Those figures are estimates rather than an official register, because England has never had a complete public record of who owns what. The land registry's coverage remains incomplete, and the largest, oldest holdings are precisely the ones least likely to have been triggered into registration by a sale. Which is a striking thing to be true of a country that documented its enclosures parish by parish, in colour, on parchment, for 250 years. We know in extraordinary detail how the land was divided in 1790. We know much less about who holds it now. The last chapter of the story is the slow, partial return of a right of access, and it is a much smaller thing than it is usually made to sound. The Countryside and Rights of Way Act of 2000 created a right of access on foot to mapped open country, mountain, moor, heath, down and registered common land. It covers something around 8% of England. It is a right to walk, not a right to graze, gather fuel, or take anything. Scotland went considerably further with the Land Reform Act of 2003, establishing a general right of responsible access to most land and inland water, subject to a statutory code. The difference between the two regimes is the clearest surviving trace of the two countries' different property histories. And the argument continues to be litigated. The case over wild camping on Dartmoor, decided in the Court of Appeal in 2023 and then in the Supreme Court, turned on whether a 19th century common statute conferred a right to camp as part of open-air recreation. The court held that it did. That case is worth noticing because of what it consisted of. Two sides arguing about the meaning of a Victorian Act over land whose status was fixed by a document written by commissioners. The instruments have not changed. The commons are still, in the most literal sense, a paperwork question. So what is the general lesson? And it is not the one the subject is usually used to teach. The lesson is not that enclosure was a crime, because in the legal sense it plainly was not, and describing it that way makes it impossible to see how it worked. It was procedurally correct at every step. That is the alarming part. The lesson is about where the decisive choices in a legal process actually sit. Not in the grand principle. Everybody agreed that property should be respected and that the improvement of agriculture was desirable. The choices sat in three places, all of them dull. First, the threshold, consent by value rather than by number, which decided in advance whose agreement mattered. Second, the burden of proof, rights had to be documented, which decided in advance who could make a claim at all. Third, the incidence of costs. The bill fell on the recipients in proportion to their allotments, which decided who could afford to keep what they had been awarded. None of those three is a statement about who should own England. Each is a piece of procedural detail that a reasonable person could defend in isolation. Together, they determined the outcome more completely than any argument of principle ever could have. That combination, an unimpeachable process, a defensible rule, and a cost placed on the party least able to bear it, is not confined to the 18th century. It is the ordinary shape of how legal change redistributes things, and it is the reason the question worth asking of any reform is not whether it is fair in principle, but who pays the cost of the transition. There is a last irony worth leaving on the table, and it is standing in the fields right now. The hedges planted under compulsion in the 1790s at the expense of people who could not afford them are now among the most protected features in the English landscape. Under the hedgerow regulations of 1997, it is an offence to remove an important hedgerow without permission, and age is one of the criteria that makes a hedgerow important. The wide straight verges laid out by enclosure commissioners are now surveyed as wildlife corridors. The rectilinear field pattern that a Georgian traveller would have called raw and new is the thing that gets called, in every tourist board photograph, the timeless English countryside. There is a real conservation argument in that, and it is not hypocrisy. A hedge planted in 1795 has had 2 centuries to acquire a population of birds, insects, and small mammals that a new one does not have. And protecting it is a sensible response to what it has become rather than an endorsement of why it was put there. But it does mean that the physical monument to the largest transfer of property in English history is now defended by law as heritage, while the transfer itself is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a vague piece of agricultural progress. Landscapes stop looking like decisions after about a century. That is roughly how long it takes for the last person who remembers the argument to die, and after that, the fences are simply where the fields are. Which is the reason to look at the map properly. Every straight line on it was drawn by somebody for a reason on a document that still exists in a county record office with a date on it and a list of who paid. Sources for this account include the enclosure, acts, and awards held in English county record offices, the General Enclosure Acts of 1801 and 1845, and the Commons Act 1876, Arthur Young's writings for the Board of Agriculture and his later inquiry into the treatment of the poor, the poetry and letters of John Clare, the reports of the Commons Preservation Society, J. L. and Barbara Hammonds, the village labourer, the work of J.D. Chambers, Gordon Mingay, and Robert Allen on enclosure and agricultural productivity, Eleanor Ostrom's studies of common pool resource governance, and the published research on modern English land ownership.